Welcome to another video of OptaTube. Today, we're breaking down the absolute massive April 2026 dual shock that literally permanently altered global energy markets. So let's dive right in. Here is our agenda for this explainer. We're going to cover the 2026 dual shock, the shift from cartel to competitive supply, the short-term market chaos, the midterm structural shift, and finally, the geopolitical power pivot. All right, Section 1, the 2026 dual shock and its simultaneous crises. Picture this. It's April 2026, and the global energy system is suddenly struck by two simultaneous, earth-shattering events. Boom! The first event hits the market instantly. A war-driven supply disruption at the Strait of Hormuz chokes off roughly 20% of global oil and liquid natural gas flows right out of the gate. Think about that for a second. 20%? That much global flow just disappearing overnight creates a visceral, immediate shock to the entire system. But, it gets even more complex. Literally at the exact same time, the UAE drops an absolute bombshell. They exit OPEC. They want to free themselves from production quotas, and this move instantly removes about 13% of production capacity right out of the cartel's control. So we've got a severe geopolitical supply disruption crashing head-on into a massive structural market regime shift. Which brings us to Section 2, cartel to competitive supply, where OPEC's control fractures. To really grasp why this exit is a complete structural break, we need to quickly look back at the historical baseline of the oil market. For decades, OPEC acted as this ultimate quantity control cartel. They set the production quotas to manage global supply, stabilize prices, basically acting as the central controller. But with the UAE's exit, remember, this is a top 3 producer demanding freedom from those quotas. That cartel discipline is deeply, deeply fractured. We're witnessing a real-time transition from a highly coordinated supply regime to a wildly competitive one. And that leads perfectly into Section 3, short-term market chaos and the scarcity-driven spike. In the short term, and by that we mean the first 0 to 6 months, this dual shock creates just absolute havoc, totally driven by scarcity. The immediate market reaction is intensely bullish across the board for oil, gas, and power. They are just flashing red with scarcity. Carbon, on the other hand, initially faces some mixed, sideways pressure. Let's break down exactly why this happens, commodity by commodity, starting with oil. Because the war abruptly takes out supply, and the UAE is logistically constrained from just exporting more right away, the scarcity premium drives oil prices sky high. We see Brent crude hit around $110 per barrel. Ultimately, this boils down to a super simple equation, the massive supply shock minus available spare capacity. Now, natural gas, that's even more sensitive. It overheats violently for a few key reasons. Those vital LNG flows through Hormuz are completely blocked. And Europe, which became highly dependent on this LNG after stepping away from Russian gas, is left incredibly vulnerable. So the big takeaway here is that European TTF prices spike even stronger than oil, mostly because they simply cannot easily replace that disrupted fuel. Naturally, this gas crisis directly infects the European power market. Fundamentally, electricity prices are set by the most expensive fuel at the margin, which is usually gas, coal, or carbon. So when gas spikes, power absolutely has to spike too. It triggers this rapid, almost mathematical chain reaction. Step 1. Gas supply plummets. Step 2, TTF gas prices spike. And step 3, power prices surge right up to match it. These extreme gas prices instantly trigger peak bullish power prices. They give everyone flashbacks to the 2022 crisis. This short-term market is completely defined by peak volatility. Okay, let's look further ahead in Section 4, midterm structural shift and structural normalization. What happens once the dust finally settles? Once we look 1 to 3 years out and logistics actually normalize, a completely new market structure emerges. Guys, this is absolutely the most critical insight of the entire explainer. The old system, the one pre-2026, relied heavily on coordinated supply, OPEC central control, and those stable, manipulated prices. But the new system, post-UAE exit, it features fragmented producers and entirely market-driven volatility. We've completely transitioned from cartel-manipulated stability into sheer competitive fragmentation. So here is how that midterm market normalizes. Free from those restrictive quotas, the UAE and the US pump a lot more oil and gas. In fact, the US steps right up as the new swing supplier. This creates a structurally bearish trend, meaning a lot of downward pressure for oil and gas prices. But catch this last point.
Without an OPEC safety net to manage all those supply dips and surges, higher, persistent volatility stays in the market permanently.
Conversely, the carbon market, which remember faced kind of sideways downward pressure during the short-term chaos, actually becomes structurally bullish in the midterm. Why? Because of continued EU decarbonization tightening. It's a really fascinating structural divergence away from the oil and gas markets. Now, for the analyst and traders watching, these opposing timelines dictate very distinct strategies. In the short term, the play is going long on immediate scarcity for oil, gas, and power while shorting carbon. But the midterm flips the whole script. You start shorting oil and gas once structural normalization kicks in, going long on carbon, and basically treating power as a volatility optionality play. It truly highlights how massive regime changes require incredibly dynamic thinking. Finally, let's explore Section 5, the geopolitical power pivot. We have to examine how this structural energy break actually intersects with the ongoing regional conflict that kicked off the disruption in the first place. A super-critical question arises when you look at the geopolitical landscape. Does this massive oil market regime shift actually alter the trajectory of the Iran-US war? Well, the short answer is no, but it severely changes the incentives. Objectively speaking, the conflict is driven by security, nuclear posturing, and regional dominance, not just oil prices. So the war itself doesn't just magically end because the market structure changed. However, the fragmentation of the cartel critically weakens OPEC's overall geopolitical leverage. U.S. energy dominance strengthens as they become that new swing supplier, and the UAE aligns much closer with U.S. interests. The vital takeaway here is that the coordinated weaponization of energy, it becomes far less effective. The world shifts from this OPEC bloc versus the West dynamic to just fragmented producers competing fiercely for market share. By the way, if you are interested in the energy market and power system modeling and want updates and insights about the global energy market, let's follow the OptaTube YouTube channel. We love breaking down these massive structural shifts so you can stay ahead of the curve. To summarize everything today, the UAE's exit isn't just some fleeting political headline. It's the definitive moment where competitive market structure finally overtakes centralized political control. It's a fundamental break in exactly how the world's most critical commodities are managed. Which leaves us with one provocative thought to end on. In this volatile new regime, totally without a stabilizing cartel, who steps in to protect global markets from the next inevitable supply shock? Thanks so much for watching, and keep asking those big questions.